So something's changing in America. I do public speaking around the United States once or twice a month. My last 3 were Fairfax, Virginia, Boise, Idaho, and I forget the third. Just to give you an idea. In Fairfax, I spoke at George Mason University, one of the most conservative universities in the world. They just added a new member of their board of directors, Brett Kavanaugh, a sitting Supreme Court judge. Don't ask me to explain why they chose, of all people on this planet, this particular person. But it's America. But the attitude towards this subject is radically different. A brief history as a way to get into this. Marxism is built around old Karl here. Born in 1818, died in 1883, a man of the 19th century. Born, by the way, very near where my father was born, on the French-German border. The town has 2 names, Trier in German and Trèves in French, because it's bilingual in the same way. Was a child of middle-class people, was given a college education, which right away puts him in the top 2 or 3%. At that time, nobody had such educations, where he studied philosophy and intended to become a professor of philosophy, which indeed was his first job. But, like me, he noticed struggles in the street, working people struggling with the local government. And he was interested, which you weren't supposed to be. And he went and talked to them, which you weren't supposed to do. And he began writing articles about their situation, which he was absolutely not to do. And the university did what they normally do. They fired him. That's his intellectual interest in that topic got him fired. This didn't bother him at all. He didn't like what he was seeing in the university anyway. So he became active with these people that he had studied and became an activist, which brought him immediately to the attention of the local police and the local authorities in Germany at that time. And so they did what the Germans and many Europeans at that time did to shut down political dissent. They didn't kill you, and they didn't imprison you. The preferred program was exile. You were sent out. And remember, Europe is a place of lots of countries in a small distance. So sending you out is putting you on a train, and an hour later, you're out. Okay, so the Germans put him on a train to Paris, and literally 2 hours later, he's in Paris, out. But they informed the Paris police that he was coming. And they met him at the train station, and they basically said to him, "You're not staying here." And they put him on a train, they exiled him to Brussels, another hour and a half, to north instead of west. And the same thing happened, the Belgian police didn't want it. You're going to London. And he ended in London, and London didn't make you leave. Those years, London was the place refugees from all over settled, and he spent the rest of his life in London, which meant most of his adult work, certainly Das Kapital, were all done as a citizen in London. His knowledge of English and his knowledge of conditions in the English-speaking part of the world was excellent, because that's where he lived most of his productive life. He even made his living for several years being a reporter, European reporter for a New York City newspaper, the New York World, during the time of the American Civil War, where he wrote many, many essays on slavery and the Civil War for the European audience, because he was a reporter for this New York newspaper. He was always a theorist and a critic and an activist. In fact, he didn't recognize that these are different words. That's an American thing. For him, he was an activist because he engaged thought. He debated different questions. He engaged in the issues of his day, like slavery and the Civil War, but many other issues too. He wrote for public consumption. He gave speeches to unions, to civic organizations. He was always active and always thinking and writing, because for him that was part of what being active was. He would not have recognized the distinction academic activist. It would have meant nothing to him. He was whatever those things combined are, all his life. He devoted himself to criticizing capitalism. It's really important. That's what he did, and he was super at it. He did not believe in describing or imagining or constructing an image of socialism or communism. He never did that. He didn't write a book about it. He didn't devote it. He mocked that. He said, I'm not a crystal ball gazer. I'm not going to tell you what the future is. Nobody knows what the future is. That's not my job. My job is to tell you what it is that's going on in capitalism in order to figure out how this system, like every other system, is going through its history. Every economic system, he argued, is born, evolves over time, and dies to be replaced by another. We have slavery, it comes, it evolves, it dies. We have feudalism, it comes, it evolves, it dies. We have primitive tribalism, it comes, capitalism, reasonably to assume, same history. Born, England, 18th or 17th century, evolves over time, becomes the world system. And let's see now, what's the next step? It dies. And it dies under its own, Marx, internal contradictions, the problems of itself as it functions. You don't die necessarily, most of you will not die because someone comes over and beats you over the head. Your own bodily, mental processes will bring you to an end. They'll wear out, whatever words you want in the system. That's how Marx understood it. He wanted to identify what's the contradiction driving capitalism. Where in this process is it? Is it growing? Is it dying? What? In order to help those of us that are living in it to, in his view, help it along to get to that next stage, because he was convinced that the human race can do better. By the way, that attitude that we can do better than the current system, that's what helped get us out of slavery. That's what helped get us out of feudalism. Reasonable to assume it'll help us get out of capitalism, unless you need to believe that in the particular period you're in, history has stopped. Well, don't laugh too quick. You live in a country which is committed to that idea, that capitalism is the greatest thing since sliced bread, probably better, and will never go away. Remember Mr. Trump, State of the Union this year? Socialism will never happen here. That's the statement made by every leader of every country just before it went socialist. Think about it. His assurance that it won't happen is worth exactly what everything else he says is worth. It's whatever occurs to him at that moment. Repeated 6 or 7 times. Marx was a critic. And how successful was he as a critic? I don't know. Let's see. He writes, he stops writing, he dies in 1883. What's it, 150 years ago, not even. In that period of time, 150 years, not very long, human history. In 150 years, his ideas have spread to every single country on the face of this earth. Every country has Marxist study groups, Marxist political parties, and or Marxist unions, and or Marxist governments, you know, little governments like the Chinese. They call themselves Marxist. Put aside for the moment exactly what they mean, but the spread of Marxism is staggeringly successful. It spread further, faster than Christianity did, or than Islam did. So if you're comparing it to global movements, whoa! All these people found something in Marxism that excited them, made them study it, made them teach it, made them publish in it. The literature on Marxism is vast and in every language. So it's a very powerful global movement. And it came to the United States too, particularly towards the middle and end of the 19th century. It came with immigrants who had encountered it in Europe and brought it with them. And it came in the form of literature and individuals who came to this country and who knew that and who spread it. And it took root here. It influenced many people, some who understood it and admitted it and were proud of it. Many more who didn't understand where their ideas came from, but they came from Marxism. And Marxism was widely studied, first at the turn of the century, then again in the 1930s because of the Great Depression, made a lot of people interested. Then again in the 1960s with the upsurge of a critical movement around the Vietnam War. And now again, in the wake of the 2008 crash, suddenly people are discovering again. But they have to rediscover it in America because it has been smashed in America. It's very important that you understand that. The smashing of Marxism was a deliberate effort to stop that criticism from taking root here. The first time it tried was in 1916. The Socialist Party of the United States, which had existed a while, ran a man for president. Ran a man for president. He did pretty well. Got 300,000 or 400,000 votes, about 3% of the vote. That was thought to be a pretty good start. So 4 years later, 1920, they ran another person, whose name you probably have heard, Eugene Victor Debs. Mr. Debs. He doubled the vote, got around 900,000 votes, but by that time, that was about 4%. Okay, that's a steady growth. Next, 1924. Well, something happened between 20 and 24. The American business community got scared. They understood, socialist, office, running, winning votes. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Socialists were running and winning, by the way, all over the United States. The state in the United States that had the most socialists in the state legislature, I usually take time, I don't have it tonight, to ask people to guess which of the 48 then states voted the most number of socialists into their state legislature. You'll never guess. Answer, Oklahoma. Think about it. Oklahoma. Bridgeport, Connecticut, not very far from here, had a socialist mayor for decades. All over the place. Milwaukee, famous for a socialist mayor, and on and on and on. But the government came down. There were the famous Palmer raids in Boston and elsewhere. The government of the United States began arresting anybody who said they were a socialist. The 1920s were the era of Sacco and Vanzetti. Some of you know American history, the history of the persecution of these people. It was older than that, but it got really going. So in 1924, the socialists ran a candidate. They wanted to get more votes, but this time they didn't call him a socialist because that was no longer safe. They called him a progressive party. A man from Wisconsin named Robert La Follette. Robert La Follette. And he got 5 million votes, at which point it became necessary to crush this thing, which they set out to do. They set it out because by this time they also had another scare, the Soviet Revolution of 1917, which showed where this could go. So you better crush it earlier. Unfortunately, the program to crush, which got really going in the 1920s, took a hit in 1929 with the Great Depression. It turned out not to be a good thing for crushing Marxism and socialism because everybody was unemployed. And so Marxism kind of came back with a vengeance. And people called themselves that. The 1930s, you had 3 powerful political parties in the United States advocating more or less Marxism. The Communist Party of the United States, very strong. The Socialist Workers' Party, a Trotskyist socialist party, and the Socialist Party, the leftover one from before. 2 socialist and 1 communist party who worked together with the CIO to make the New Deal, to make the thing that wasn't green yet. But the model for the Green New Deal was then. And when then the war with Hitler comes about, the United States takes the next step of a scary embrace of Marxism. it becomes allied with the Soviet Union in fighting Hitler, which makes an official partnership between American capitalism and Soviet, whatever you want to call that. So that the post offices across America had a big picture above the window where you buy your stamps. And there was Uncle Sam, arm in arm with Uncle Joe, for Joseph Stalin, who was our buddy, our bosom buddy. He was in the post office, in every post office. By the end of the war, the American business community was apoplectic. The attempt to crush in the 20s had been first postponed and then lost sight of. Marxist, socialist, communists were everywhere, and it needed a crusade to get rid of them. McCarthyism. The last half century is a half century lost in this country for Marxism. Everybody who had anything to do with Marxism forgot about it. To make sure you understood it, they arrested the leaders of the Communist Party and deported them or imprisoned them. And everybody else was scared to death. The reason my teachers at Harvard couldn't teach me Marxism was they had learned early in their careers to keep as far away from all of that stuff as possible. When I was finishing my PhD at Yale, I was called in by one of my professors, the famous man. Some of you may know his name, James Tobin, a very famous professor, got a Nobel Prize in economics. Called me into his office, worked with him, and said to me, Rick, you know, this political stuff you do, it's going to destroy your career. And to make it real tangible, he said, I won't be able to write letters for you. That's how you get a job. If you go to the Ivy League, when you're done, you get a PhD, your professor writes a letter or makes a phone call, and then you get a job. Other people have to submit documents and give talks and have a resume. I never did that. I went once to Johns Hopkins, where they wanted me to go, and I went to Johns Hopkins and I gave a talk, and the professor said, are you ready to give your talk? Yes. He said, you know something, but how about let's have a drink instead? Okay. So we went to a bar, we had a drink. There was no talk. I got the job offer the next day. Other people do that, but people in the Ivy League don't do that. That's not how this country works. So when people in this country get interested in socialism, each time they have to rediscover anew that this is a big, fat tradition, been around for 150 years, exists in many forms, many articulations. It's a rich tradition of criticizing capitalism. In its name, some people have gone beyond criticizing capitalism to try to create an alternative. That hasn't been so successful yet. But that's not so surprising because the project wasn't the alternative. Marx didn't believe in that. It was the critique of what exists. That's Marxism's strength. And if you're a critic of capitalism, and let me remind you, in the last 3 weeks, both Gallup and Harris, two major polling companies in the United States, have issued the following result. People 40 years of age and younger in this country are roughly split 50-50 in their preference for socialism or capitalism. 2.5 weeks ago, I did an hour-long program on Fox News devoted to capitalism versus socialism, where they invited me and a young African-American woman from the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. Very articulate, very good. You know, the two of us were the socialist side, and sitting next to me representing the other side was Herman Cain. That's right. That's right. That's right. The 999 man who kept repeating the same story. If you go look at the clips, that socialism has never worked anywhere and capitalism has always worked wonderfully everywhere. He repeated that. You're not dealing with a full deck here. He doesn't have it. But the fact that he could say it, and he says it with real confidence and with conviction, he really does, is because he must circulate in a place where no one ever questions any. You can say this, blah, 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 and everyone nods, and so you're emboldened to say it, even in there in the public where people will realize what a moron you must be. And the others were the same. I mean, he was a bit out front with it, but they also paraded through to debate with us. Lou Dobbs, Neil Cavuto, Stuart Varney, and a woman who had only one name, Kennedy. No one identified her as having I don't know if Kennedy was the first name, the last name, or whether she doesn't need two names like the rest of us. She was the worst. She was a libertarian as a whole. Anyway, so this book is written because Americans are now asking in huge numbers, what is this? What is this Marxism? No, but my heart sinks. My God, 2019, and you're asking a question, what is it? Like, where have you been for 150 years? Right? Did you have a long nap? What is this? On the other hand, I'm elated because they're asking a question. That's 9/10 of it. The answer is easy. It's the getting you interested enough to ask the question that matters. And the book is selling. We produced this ourselves. We didn't go through a regular publisher. I published a lot of books regularly. And the book is selling because there's interest. There's interest trying to figure it out. Young people particularly, but others too, are trying to figure out what's wrong with American capitalism. And if you're going to study what's wrong with the system we live in, capitalism, which is now global, sooner or later you're going to come to Marxism. There's no way to avoid that. It is the single most developed critical tradition of capitalism there is, period. It's not the only one, but it's the one that the most number of people in every culture have developed their thinking around, have developed their tragedies and their successes and their failures around, practical ones, whether it's to make a revolution or organize a union or have a strike or whatever it is that people do. This tradition of Marxism, with its many different formulations and different strands, including many that don't agree with each other at all, it's the single most developed repository. To become a critic of capitalism and not engage Marxism, that's crazy. That's like saying I want to go into the woods and make a nice fire to cook something, but what's this silly crap about matches? I mean, you could take the stick. There are other ways, but you know, people have developed the stick, the match. It goes in your pocket. Doesn't weigh a lot. It'll save you one hell of a lot of time. Marxism is that. It won't answer every question, won't solve every problem. Not at all. And there are mistakes and screw-ups all over the place. But it is what we've developed, the most sophisticated development in the history of the anti-capitalist movement. To not engage it, to not learn it, to not milk out of it all of the insights that could help take us to the next step, that's nuts. That's not smart, that's stupid. My education was defective in the United States because my teachers were afraid. They didn't reject Marxism, they didn't know what it was. They knew it wasn't safe. They were just scared. And they didn't have the decency to admit it. Would have saved my generation a lot. Okay, you're scared. Tell me why. They would have told me why. I don't want to lose my job. I understand that. I get that. Okay. Instead, I'm angry. You didn't teach me things I should have learned, and you didn't have the decency to tell me you were too afraid to do it. So the time is to do it now. Maria, start us off. We asked people to send in questions. We've been overwhelmed. The number of questions that came in, how many is it in the end?
Over 200.
Over 200 questions of people who knew we were going to do this tonight. So we've selected some. What?
We're going to extend this to midnight?
No.
Okay, so the first question comes to us from Ignacio Ramirez, and he asks, to end exploitation, you've suggested worker co-ops. Honestly, it's taken too long to get there. Can some of this be blamed on the so-called progressive policies that somewhat aim to help the poor? Had we gone full-blown capitalism with minimal or no help to the poor, i.e. no New Deal in the Great Depression, do you think the transition to a democratic workplace would have been sooner and quicker? What would Marx say about the progressive agenda, union, Social Security, unemployment benefits, that even though help a little bit, hindered the transition to a more democratic workplace? Do you think he would want going progressive agenda by agenda until we finally make the transition to have a more revolutionary transition, or have a more revolutionary transition? And the second question, I'm just gonna, no, it's also about revolution, so I'm just gonna read it. Robert Hand asks of a similar question. Understanding that socialism preceded Marx and that his focus was the analysis of capitalism, not socialism, how would Marx evaluate social democratic efforts like the New Deal and Great Society programs of the 20th century US to reform capitalism as opposed to overthrowing capitalism via peaceful or violent revolution? So they're both questions about the need for revolution.
Right. This question of reform versus revolution is very old. It's been part of the left debates before Marx, during Marx's time, and since. It arises perennially, and so it's perfectly appropriate and reasonable that it would be raised again now. There's a lot of ways of putting it. Let me be as blunt about it as in the interest of time as I can. So, reform. All the word reform has ever meant is that you leave the basic system there, either because you believe it isn't such a bad system, or it's too much to undertake to change it. Let's go step by step. Let's change this aspect of it. Let's change that aspect of it. And let's hope, A, that it makes things tangibly better for people in the short run, and that over time, people will kind of get an appetite for more of this until they kind of step by step bring the big change about. Sometimes it's been called gradualism. It has a variety of names. What are some of the reforms that people critical of capitalism have offered? Actually, there's loads of them. Here's a few. A minimum wage. You intervene in the bargaining between capital and labor, and you say, this has reduced working class people to levels of poverty that are unacceptable, so we're going to intervene with the government and have a law. You can't pay less than this. It's a minimum wage, and if you pay less than that, we're going to arrest you, shut your business, and put you in jail, which is a powerful argument, and then that's a reform. Here's another one. You can't let interest rates go above 20%. 30%. They don't want to get it too strict here. So, that's a cap on interest rates. That's a kind of policy like that. An earned income credit, if you know how the tax system in this country works. These are all reforms. A welfare program that says if you're out of unemployment insurance, you lose your job, we're the government, we're going to collect taxes, and we're going to give you some money to get through the unemployment. We're not going to let you just be destroyed by the way capitalism works, namely depriving you of a job. These are reforms. They don't fundamentally order a different economic system. And people have been very, typically, impatient about this. Why? Seems to take a long time. It seems to leave a lot of bad things while you fix this one. Even, let's be a little bit daring, the New Deal. The New Deal said, if you're 65 years of age or older, we're going to give you a check every month until the rest of your life. Wow, we never did that before. That's an intrusion into capital that makes older people have something to fall back on and makes younger people less burdened by taking care of their parents, et cetera, et cetera. So Social Security, that's part of the New Deal. Minimum wage, that was part of the New Deal. Unemployment insurance, we never had those things before the 1930s. Government jobs on a massive scale, that was also in the 1930s. These are reforms. What does it mean that they didn't change the basic system? Now, this gets interesting. They didn't take private enterprises away from the people who owned them. They didn't reorganize the production process. The simplest way to describe it is, instead of there being, and here, be very simple in your thinking. Don't be complicated, because these are not complicated issues. A small number of people run every business. The owner, the board of directors, these are small numbers of people. 2, 6, 9, 12. And then there's the mass of the employees, who can number in the tens of thousands, or in the case of Walmart, millions. So the number of people who run the enterprise is very small. And the number of people who work in the enterprise is very large. And who makes all the decisions? The small group. And who has to live with the decision? The big group. That's not democracy, folks. That's the opposite. A democratic workplace would say everybody has an equal vote. You know, like everybody has a vote for the mayor in the town, because the mayor makes decisions you have to live with, so you get to vote for the mayor. Yeah, but the boss in your workplace makes decisions you have to live with. You get to vote on nothing. How interesting. A country committed to democracy excludes the workplace from the demand for democracy. The workplace, where 5 out of 7 days, your entire adult life, you spend. Democracy should have been introduced there, if you believe in it, which clearly we don't. We pretend to, but we don't. A revolutionary change would change all of that. Would say that enterprises are the property of everybody, and that the operation of an enterprise should be everybody's concern in a democratic way. That would be a fundamental change. It's the kind of fundamental change that socialists and communists and Marxists and anarchists of many stripes have endorsed for a long time. So the question is, are you a reformist or are you a revolutionary? That issue has divided people terribly. The people who are impatient and want to make a revolution don't want to be sidetracked by all these little things. They see that the basic problem is the system. On the other hand, people have a hard time getting their head around the notion, change a system. The system is very complicated. The system has many parts. You don't know quite where to start. Not everybody sees the system the same way. A particular reform is kind of more definable and focused. So it becomes a practical question and not just a theoretical one. The resolution most have come to, not all, not by a long shot, but the resolution most have come to is that this debate is more abstract than helpful. In other words, the left movements for socialism have always ended up doing both things to varying degrees. If the conditions allow you to make a frontal attack on the system, you go for it. And if the conditions don't allow you, you don't just throw in the towel and, well, we can't make a revolution, so what, we could go to the beach? No, you go and you start pushing on those things that people will work with you, where you can get masses of people, and you hope, Marx's idea and the idea of many Marxists since, you hope that the struggles for reform become schools in which those who get caught up in the struggle learn in a very concrete way why the reform isn't enough. You struggle real hard and you have a minimum wage. And then you have one. And then how much has changed? Okay? And then you discover also that if it's capitalism and you get a reform and you don't change the system, you discover pretty quick that capitalism fights you to prevent you from getting the reform. And if they lose and you get the reform, they don't stop fighting. They try to take it away. And because you've left them in a position of power, they own the enterprises, they grab the wealth, you leave them with the very means to undo the reforms you will have struggled so hard to win. So that the idea, the hope is that the struggle for the reform produces the revolutionary, who recognizes after a while that the revolution is the only way to make those reforms stick, to make them permanent, to not work so hard to get something and then see it all undone. In the 1930s, the United States got the New Deal. In the 50 years since then, it was taken back. Most of it's gone. You can't live on Social Security. The whole idea of Social Security was you could live on it. You can't possibly. I mean, there may be some people in the room that are doing it, but they're consuming a lot of cat food. You can't. You can't. The minimum wage has been abused. When was the last time they raised it? 1997 or something like that. I mean, it's just disgusting. The inflation erodes it all the time. They don't keep it up. It's just, they can take it away. You don't change the system. You create it. It's like having a war, and at the end of country A defeats country B. What does country A do? Does it leave in the hands of country B all the tanks, all the bullets, all the guns? Don't do that. Those people are mad that they lost. They're going to use that and fight another day. So you better do some more so that doesn't happen. Disarm them or something. Reformers discover that if they don't change the system, look, that's America. In the 1930s, capitalism tottered. The people who confronted capitalism in the 1930s, the communists, the socialists, and the unions, they talked about revolution, and they meant it. Remember, the communists, that was only a few years after what happened in Russia. They had a concrete example of what they could have done, and they thought about doing that here. But Roosevelt was a very clever leader, and he came back to them, and he said, you know what, I'm going to give you a lot of the things you want, the reforms you're demanding. But the condition is, I don't want to hear about revolution anymore. You got to stop that talk. That's got to stop. You got to turn on those communists and socialists in your rank and stop talking about it. And they agreed. There were always a few who didn't, but the bulk of the communists and socialists agreed. And Roosevelt was good for his word. He gave them Social Security, he gave them unemployment, he gave them a minimum wage, and he gave them 15 million government jobs. It was amazing what he did. But they got the reforms. They didn't get the revolution. Who knows if they could have, but they didn't. They didn't make that effort. And here we are, 70 years later, discovering that 2/3 of what they got in the 1930s, they've lost. That's why the revolutionary cry today is another New Deal, a green one. I'm in favor of it. And nothing, you know, I love AOC, all of that. I do. But you have to face what this is. So the reform and revolution, I think Marx would have been one of those to say, you fight for what can be moved forward for the mass of the working people. Because it's never just what you're fighting for. It's the process of the fighting that teaches many lessons. The benefits of organization, the benefits of unity of different groups, the tactics and strategy needed to overcome all of our differences so that we can act in a solidary way. All of those lessons are profound, and they can be learned even if the thing you're struggling for isn't what you wish it would be. The trick of good leaders on the left, Marxists, if they thought about and read all of what I'm summarizing for you, would be precisely that the difference between a Marxist and another is not whether or not you fight for reform. It's how you fight for reform. Do you do it as an end in itself? Or do you do it as a step and a stage to something fundamentally revolutionary, which you think is the only way to secure whatever reform you get? You do things that way, then the dichotomy between the two kind of falls away, and they become parts of one another. And I think that's the Marxist.
Call that schools for revolution?
Yes, schools for revolution. Be as good a phrase as any, and one of the many that have been used. One of the arguments, because it's another question that Maria will probably get to, is about the role of unions. It has always been the idea, Marxist idea, that the union is an important learning process, school if you like, a school for struggle, a school to understand what you're up against, the employer, and how the employer works, and how the employer's tactics and strategy involved. Yes, a strike is not a change of the social system, but it is an important battle, and out of that battle, you learn things and you develop solidarities that can be then worked on for different and broader objectives. So you shouldn't see it as either or. The debate, is this enough or not, is academic in the negative sense. That we need fighting everywhere. We need reforms to be fought for, and if it's possible, more to be fought for. And when you fight for reforms, always in the back of your mind, the lesson that has to be learned, you hope, by people struggling for reform is the need for more than that. Much of what I do the last several years has been to hammer at the point, some of you listen or watch the shows we do, this is a systemic problem. For Americans, this is a new thought. For many, the notion that this is a system we're battling, not just Mr. Trump or not just, this is a system. And if you don't understand and change that system, you're going to be very frustrated about the other things you do focus yourself on. Understanding that the system is the ultimate problem is also a way to handle defeat in struggles for reform. Don't make the reform everything, because then when you lose the people because they feel frustrated, they feel lost, they feel hopeless, very dangerous. Something the other side understands all too well. That's why they fight against even little reforms that wouldn't fundamentally shake them. They understand, yes, it wouldn't shake us, but we don't want that taste for victory that comes out of solidarity. We want that. They don't want that. They don't want it.
All right, I apologize for messing up this person's name. Christopher Radeball asks, what were some of Marx's biggest mistakes? In what ways was he responsible for the atrocities committed by Russia, China, Cambodia? And can those governments legitimately be considered Marxist?
Right. I want to separate the Marxist mistakes from all those other things. I mean, there's a certain unfairness in Marx was dead in 1883. There was no Soviet Union, and to hold him accountable, who died in 1883, for something that happened 34 years later, seems somewhat unreasonable. So I'm not going to go there. Mistakes, all kinds of things. Marx, just give you a few ideas. Marx thought that he owed a great deal to the analysts of capitalism from whom he learned. One of the questions we may have time for that came asked me to talk about some of the other works Marx did. What should you read for your different kinds of interest? Well, one of the works Marx wrote, very poorly known. In fact, I'm not aware of hardly anybody who I always did, but there were a few of us. But Marx wrote a 3-volume work, not called Das Kapital, which is the famous one everybody knows, but called Theories of Surplus Value. Completely different work. Also 3 volumes, 3 fat books. And what they are notebooks kept by Marx, notebooks when he read all the preceding thinkers of economics. You know, he was a refugee, as I told you. He lived in London most of his adult life, and he worked in the British Museum, a very famous structure in the middle of London. And there he read all of the literature of economics that was gathered there. It's very useful for him. By the way, long analysis of Adam Smith, long analysis of David Ricardo, if you know some of the names of major thinkers in the tradition of economics, pro-capitalist economics. And he read them in great detail, and he kept very careful notes, what he liked in what he read from them, what he took from them, what he rejected, and why he rejected it. You will not find, I mean, I'm a professor of economics, done this all my life, there are very few, in the history of economics as a discipline, very few thinkers who ever did that kind of preparation for the work they did. In fact, here in the United States, there's really only one who was an immigrant also, I believe from Russia, a man, some of whose the name you may know, Joseph Schumpeter. He was a professor at Harvard. He wrote a book, The History of Economic Thought. It is a book that fat. It is the great book that Americans and many others study to get a sense of the discipline. Marx did as much work as Schumpeter ever did. And you can really see what Marx takes. Well, one of the things he takes from Smith and Ricardo, which may surprise some of you, is the labor theory of value. Many of you have, if you've studied this stuff at all, have been told by a teacher who does not know that this is a Marxian invention. It is not. Smith had a labor theory of value, so did Ricardo. Marx liked that they did that. He took that from them, and he thanks them at great length in the theories of surplus value. He then did his own thing with it. He changed the theory for his purposes and used it in ways they didn't, but he acknowledges his debt to them. Well, one of the things Marx did was he thought he could explain prices, the prices that occur in the economy, by using the labor theory of value. He didn't do it, he just thought you could do it. That's a mistake. You can't do that. The labor theory of value is a theory of value, and value is not the same thing as a price. And you have to, there's a way of going through that in the material. If I had time, I would teach that to you. I do that in my classes all the time. But he kind of mumbled these together. He wanted people to get excited about the theory of value, so he said it could help understand prices. And the reason he did that is because most people in his time, as in ours, think that explaining prices is what economics is about. That's what I was taught. Harvard and Yale, that's what economics is about. Explain why the price of a shirt is $3 and not $300. That's a big question. You know, if you live in a market economy where everything is a matter of price, you can see why people want to understand prices. It's kind of urgent. But that was not Marx's issue. He wasn't interested in studying prices. He was interested in studying capitalism as a system and change. So it was a mistake to go in that direction. Here's another one. He thought that Europe was the most developed part of the world. He was, what we would nowadays call, somewhat Eurocentric. He was very interested in what had happened in other parts of the world, but he did buy into a good bit of the notion of the advanced and the primitive, and that's a part of his time. He wasn't separate from his time. He was influenced by the things that influence you. In retrospect, we would say, not so good. He had another mistake. He didn't handle the relationship between the organization he started, which was called the International Working Men's Benevolent Association, an organization he founded in 1864, which was the first international. You know, there were later the Second International, the Third. He organized the first one. And he did that together with a man named Bakunin, an anarchist from Russia, because the anarchists and the Marxists felt very close. But they had a falling out after a few years. They went their separate ways. And the relationship between anarchism and Marxism has been kind of rocky on and off ever since. One of the people who tried to put it back together again was the Russian leader Lenin, who believed that one of the goals of the Russian Revolution was to accomplish what he called the withering away of the state, a remark which every anarchist in the world enjoys deeply. It was an attempt to rebuild an alliance. That's going on in this country too, as anarchism has an attraction, particularly for newly engaged leftists, partly because it's a way to be very leftist without getting close to that Marxism, which is scary. Anarchism hasn't been the focus. It was once in American history. You all know the origin, I assume, of May Day. May Day is the celebration in every country of the earth, except this one, of workers and of the solidarity of workers and of the revolutionary spirit. May Day is when, you know, the workers march down the streets of Paris or Rome or London or Moscow or Beijing. It's the holiday everywhere. In this country, the anti-communism after World War II was so intense that they ended May Day and moved it to Labor Day. So it wouldn't happen at the beginning of the summer in May, but in September. I mean, this is childish shit. But you live in it. Right? So do I. Well, where did May Day start? It started in Chicago. This is the double irony. The whole world celebrates a holiday for the working class whose origin is American, which is the one place that doesn't celebrate it. Why? Because there was a demonstration in Chicago, a demonstration fighting for the 8-hour day, that the day wouldn't be too long. Workers have always tried to shorten the working day. And it kind of got out of hand, and a policeman or two were killed, and they arrested a whole bunch of anarchists and executed a number of them for that crime. And it was felt to be a frame-up and became a national holiday. So it's an American holiday that the rest of the world celebrates, and America doesn't. And it comes out of the same kind of issue. So another one?
Yeah. Greg Chung asks, he's a freshman organizer in Cornell College. He lives in Iowa, where 92% of the land is dedicated to farming. I have heard farmers described as working class, but also as small business owners who hire labor. I wanted to ask, what is the Marxist perspective on farmers, and how do farmers fit in the labor theory of value?
Yeah, the reason this is a wonderful question is it allows me to explain to you what the Marxist method is in trying to analyze any population that you're interested in, a village, a state, a country, a period of time. And what Marx is really interested in is saying, let's look at something that others haven't looked at, and because they haven't, they missed things which we want to focus on. What does he mean? He means that in every human community, this is the most fundamental, in my judgment, contribution Marx makes. In every community, whether people are aware of it or not, they make certain arrangements. They may not be conscious of it. Just like all of you know, in a modern world of psychological self-awareness, that there are things you do where, if you're honest to yourself, you can't explain to yourself or anyone around you why you just said that, why you just did that, why you looked at that person in just that way. And some of you go and get professional help to try to figure out why you do this. My wife's a psychotherapist, might explain these things, who knows? Right? And Marx is that too, but on a social scale. So he says, I want you to think about one of the things that every community does that it is typically unaware of, but that shapes it. And here's what every community does. It takes a portion of its members. If it's a community of 100, it takes 20 of them. If it's a community of 50,000, it takes X. And those people are assigned to a particular function. They're to use their brains and their muscles to make things, to take things in nature, say a tree, and make a chair, to take a sheep and make a woolen shirt, or whatever. Then there are a lot of people in the society who are not required to do that. Some of them you can see right quickly. A 2-year-old is not going to be asked to do this thing we call work, because it's 2. And another one is 89, and for a comparable reason, we're not going to ask him or her either. So it means that in every society, Marx says, the people who do the work always have to produce more than they themselves consume. Otherwise, all the people who are part of the society couldn't survive. Somehow there has to be an excess produced by those who do the work, so that all those who don't, the children, the ancient, but lots of others, we're going to get to that in a minute, who don't do work, are supported, are provided with the food, the clothing, the shelter, without which they would die. Now, Marx says what happens in each society is they differ in how they organize that. The word, and it's a bad translation, but the word Marxists use to describe this producing more, they focus on the surplus, that the people who do work produce more than they themselves consume. In German, it's mehr. The German word is M-E-H-R, which means more in German. It's much simpler, it's clear. Surplus introduces, you know, an old army jacket or something. It's not that. But surplus is the way it got it translated into English. So every society produces a surplus. What differs from one society to another is who produces the surplus. And who decides how big a surplus there'll be? And who decides who gets the surplus from the people who produced it to all the people who need it to live on but don't participate in producing? How do all those things get worked out? And how they do shapes the politics and the culture and the art and the music. In other words, if you want to understand the politics, the culture, the art, the music, the history, you better understand something as basic as the production and distribution of the surplus. That's called, in Marx, class analysis. The class of people who produce the surplus in relationship to the class of people who live off distributions. And just to give you an idea, to tantalize you, here's one way it can be done. The people who produce a surplus can be the people who also get the surplus. They get their own surplus, and then they sit around and decide what to do with it. And they distribute it to babies, and they distribute it to old people, and they distribute it to musicians, and whoever else they think they would like to have. While they're working in the fields, they want someone to play the mandolin, and they got to feed that one, and they got to clothe that one. So they take a portion of the surplus and they do that. But we could have a different system. We could have a system in which the people who produce the surplus, let's give them a name, slaves. Ooh, then we know who gets the surplus real quick, don't we? The master. And who decides what to do with the surplus? The master who got it. That's a very different arrangement. I mean, you can be damn sure that that master is going to distribute that surplus differently from how the workers would have if they got their own surplus. A worker co-op is when workers who produce the surplus are the same people who decide what to do with it. And that makes it different from capitalism, slavery, or feudalism. In slavery, the slaves produce the surplus, the masters get and distribute it. In feudalism, the serfs produce the surplus and the lords get it and distribute it. In capitalism, the employees produce the surplus and the employer gets it and decides what to do with it. The revolution, the Marxist idea, says we got to get rid of this dichotomy. No more of this. We don't want the slave, we don't want the serf, and we don't want the proletarian employee either. Because we don't want a tiny minority, master, lord, employer, deciding what the surplus, what is going to be done with it when all the people have produced the surplus, are excluded from that decision. That's a fundamental question. Now, farmers. Well, now you have the apparatus. Just use it for the farmer. And it turns out farmers have different class arrangements, just like everybody else. So, for example, we could have farming done by a slave and a master. That's what we had in the American South for a long time. We had cotton, for example, grown by slaves, and the surplus was taken by the masters, and they made beautiful mansions down there in Louisiana. You can see them to this day. They did what they wanted to do with the surplus. The slaves produced it, the masters decided how to use it. Or you can go to France. The peasants produced a vast surplus gathered by the feudal lords who used the surplus to construct the palace at Versailles, which you as a tourist can go visit and marvel at. What do you think the peasants who busted their ass in that time would have used the surplus to make a garden like that for 3 people to walk through every 4th night? No. No, they wouldn't have done that. Jeffrey Bezos collects the surplus from hundreds of thousands of people engaged in the monumentally important task of delivering packages. He is a package deliverer. He's the richest person on earth because obviously any rational society would want to give a vast amount of wealth to a person who delivers packages. But let's be fair, he delivers packages quickly. So of course he should have $150 billion. He's the number one on the Bloomberg billionaires list. He recently got divorced from Mackenzie, his wife, and by the virtue of the divorce, she got 39 million, so she becomes the 22nd richest person on this planet, having been his ex-wife. Do you think, just between you and me, if the workers who produce the surplus for Amazon, all those people schlepping your package really quickly to your house, if they got together to decide what to do with the surplus that their labor had produced, you think they'd give it to Mr. Bezos so he could, by the way, one of the things he's doing, he's very excited. He's arranging planetary travel. He's going to the moon, and he's spending a fortune to develop the rockets to take him to the moon. Ooh, you think the people who sweat in his workshops, that's what they would do? Spend the surplus to have a rocket ship take that man to the moon? My hope is that Americans looking at this situation would probably say, yes, get him out of here. Anyway, go ahead.
There was a question about unions under socialism or Marxism.
Right. Actually, I realized I didn't finish the other question. So let me finish the farmer. So you can have farmers set up as co-ops. By the way, that exists. Farmers is one of the places where co-ops actually have been quite successful around the world, including here in the United States. It's a long history where farmers get together and cooperatively raise animals or grow the wheat or make the corn or whatever it is that they do, and they collectively do it to divide the labor. They have a meeting, they divide the labor, and at the end of the labor, they get together and decide what to do with the product. They are producers of a surplus. They produce more than they themselves consume, but then they collectively and democratically decide what to do with it. By the way, Marx has a name for when workers together as a community do the work, and then as a community decide what to do with the surplus they produce. He calls that communism. You know, the ism out of community. It shouldn't frighten you, really. You tell by the way, I use different language and describe what I just did. I don't call it communism, I call it something else. And wherever I go in the United States, people think it's a lovely idea. They remember a grandmother who did that, or a grandpa who did that. They're not scared at all. When I tell them it's communism, they have a small heart attack. I went out to California a few years ago, to Silicon Valley, to San Jose. And I met there with engineers who had walked away from big jobs. It's just like with the farmers. They walked away from a big job working for Cisco or IBM or any of those monster companies, earning $200,000-$300,000 a year, big salary. They quit. They hated it. Some guy in suits came and told them what they had to do and what software to develop. They hated that. They had to wear a tie and a jacket. They didn't want to. They were California people. They wanted to come high as a kite with Bermuda shorts, you know, and they wanted to have a Frisbee, a dog, a child, or whatever, you know, very California. They hated all this. So they quit. And they got together in somebody's in somebody's garage, and everybody brought a laptop. And they said, we don't want to work that way. We want to come in our Bermuda shorts. We want to smoke whatever there is. We want to have our dog with us. And we're going to work Monday through Thursday. We make software like we always did. Friday, we sit around and decide what to do with our little business. And they described this to me. And I said, this is wonderful. You are all communists. They were horrified. They wanted me to use the phrase, ready? Get ready. Very American. We are entrepreneur, and we are all entrepreneurs, and this is an entrepreneurial innovation. And I said to them, you can call it a purple giraffe, I don't care. I'm telling you, you walked away from capitalism. You literally quit your capitalist job to form a communist enterprise. According to what Marx wrote, most of these people were Republicans. They were Republicans because they're in love with entrepreneur. No one had ever told them anything about Marxism. Where were they going to get the idea? Of course, they thought it was an entrepreneurial innovation because that's the language in which they grew up. Once I explained it to them, they had to struggle. Turns out they really like communism. Here's what they told me, by the way. You know why we stay with this? We are much happier here. We feel better every day. We look forward to coming here. We're much more productive this way. We come up with new ideas. We cross-fertilize one another. I hear what she's doing. She hears what I'm doing. And then they began to get excited. And they said to me, you know something? The biggest breakthroughs in the work I'm doing, that was done after we left the big company. The big company is stifling us. Wow, I said. You're the best advertisement for communism I can think of, you Republicans. But that's America. See, the dialectic, having taught nobody anything about it, except to hate it and fear it, when you actually translate it into something they can understand, it turns out that they like it. Oh, they haven't been taught to not like the reality. They've been taught to not like a caricature. And when you tell them that the caricature, here's what we're talking about, oh, that's pretty good. Farmers, can they be capitalist? Of course they can. Big farming in the United States is called agribusiness for a reason. These are big capitalist corporations. They're run by a board of directors, and they have an army of farmers who are workers. Of course they are. They are wage workers, just like the people working on Amazon. If we allowed it in this country, we would have slave farming. I take that back. We do have slave farming. You do know in the United States, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution outlaws slavery, except in prisons. And we put people in prisons, overwhelmingly people of color in this society, for a long time. Michelle Alexander has explained that to all of us. If you have never read her work, by the way, just a footnote, this is a sharp American historian, and she's here in the New York area. I think she teaches at Barnard or Columbia, one of the places here. What's the name of her book? I always forget the title. The New Jim Crow, that's it. Really, it's a remarkable way, how slavery is preserved by the incarceration of people now. But if you have incarcerated people, and you require them to do work, and many American prisons have prison labor, then you have slave labor. I mean, that's what you do. That's one of the reasons why the United Nations is always poking itself into the American prison system, because slavery is supposed to be outlawed by international law and so forth, and we have it. And we have it for the same people we had it a while back. So farming can be done in any one of these class systems. But what Marxism does is it says how you organize the production and distribution of surplus shapes who you are, what your relationships with other people are. If you go to, I mean, you really all know this. If you go to work in the United States, you're going to be working overwhelmingly in a capitalist enterprise. You're going to be a drone. You're going to be a person who comes at 8 and stays until 5. And you do what you're told. You sit there and you work with that and you do this. And when you're done, you leave what you've produced and you go home. When you go home, you have pizza, you have a beer, you go to sleep, and you come back the next day and you do all that again. You are in charge of nothing. Everything is told to you. You live in a work dictatorship, and you're not the dictator. This is sort of arresting. That's a particular way of organizing production. It could be organized otherwise. For me, the revolution against capitalism has to include the transformation of the workplace, because that's where adults spend most of their lives. That's where an enormous part of your self-identification, of your relationships, of your attitude towards the world are shaped. To think that you have gone beyond capitalism because you have socialized the means of production, the state takes over, or you have planning instead of markets. I'm not against any of that. but you haven't begun to transform the lives of the people on a daily basis by transforming the workplace. And if I had time with you, I would also talk about transforming the household, because that too is a place where you are shaped, you and the children coming up after you. Marxism is about the transformation of one kind of society into another. Here's a parallel. In the attempt to get rid of slavery in the United States, the anti-slavery movement, the movement to do something about American slavery, there was a split. There was a large number of people who were horrified by American slavery in the American South and who wanted slaves not to be separated, husband from wife or parents from children. Remember that? There was a struggle to get them fed better, to get them clothed better, to give them better housing. And then there were the people who said, are you crazy? The problem isn't that they don't eat enough, sleep enough. The problem is that they're slaves. And what we want is abolition of slavery, not a better paid slave. Well, the modern equivalent is what you want for the working class, that they get a higher wage. That's like giving the slave more money, or more food, or more clothing. You give workers more money, they go to the mall, stay more hours. Is that it? Is that it? Better working conditions, better wages? Or is the problem that it's a worker who doesn't have any control over his or her life in the workplace, and consequently not much control anywhere else either? Why are we surprised that Americans don't participate in political democracy when we deny them workplace democracy? Where the hell would they get the incentive or the knowledge or the skill or the ability or the appetite for democracy if it's denied to them where they are 5 days of the week, all the best hours of that day? Come on. These ideas, you see, are not that complicated. Marxism goes to the core of the organization of production and distribution of surplus. How are you going to do that? And it wants that question answered. How the farmers do it will shape the class positions and class categories that the farmers, but the same is true of craftspeople, the same is true of intellectuals in the university. It doesn't make any difference. They are all working to produce and distribute surplus, and if you begin to examine that, then you see how that arrangement, of which so many people are unconscious, shapes them. Just like if you've never been introduced to psychological terminology, you are not aware that when you were 4 years old, things happened to you that are still roiling around in your brain and making it very hard for you to have good relationships with other people, which makes you sad. You're going to have to go back and figure out what those events back then were, even though you've developed lots of techniques to avoid doing that. You have to do that with social thinking too. If you're going to solve your personal problems, Americans now they go to shrinks, they think about psychological issues, they understand terms like trauma, they've learned. But you got to do that for the social analysis too. It's really quite parallel.
I think we have time for one more, and then we can turn it to the audience. The question was, how would unions fit in under socialism or Marxism? Right.
Well, partly we've already answered it. Unions. Well, you know, in the capitalist system, Marxists have always been very active in, very committed to, often leaders of labor unions. It's been a natural place that Marxists go because it's an organization of the working class for the working class by definition. So Marxists have always been close to, committed to unions. But there again, then the question becomes, and this is what we started with 45 minutes ago. The reform and revolution issue surfaces right again. Are you going to be an activist pushing for a higher wage? Well, the Marxist answers, it's not a question of whether you're for that or against it. We Marxists are all for it. But it's how. How is this presented? Do you present it by saying, we, I don't know, need more for our families? Okay, that's one way to do it. Or the employer is very rich and can afford to give it. That's another way to do it. But then there's another way, which is to say, why are we in the position, doing all the work here, of having to beg for a bit more of what we produce? There's something wrong here. Why aren't we part of the apparatus that decides what to do with what we have produced? Don't we have some claim on the output that our brains and muscles help to produce? We all remember the Christmas party last year when the drunken employer got up on a wobbly chair, thanked us all for the great year this company had, and then fell off the chair. We all thought to ourselves in that nasty moment, he's thanking us for doing all the work. Let's show some thanks here, Jack. Where's the money? That part you're keeping. So the thank you is all verbal. There's no, what? I don't want your thanks. I want your company. I want to take over. This is my project. You know, if you grow up in the United States, you hear often from employers or people who have been bamboozled by them that, gee, the employer takes a risk. He deserves some extra, some profit, because he took a risk. I always found this extraordinary. He did take a risk, but so did everybody else. You idiot. What? The worker who moved into this state to get that job took a risk that the job would be there, that the job would be bearable, that the job would pay enough. Took a risk. Takes a risk every day he comes in. He doesn't know whether at the end of the day he'll be told not to show up tomorrow. He bought a house based on the risk that that income would be coming. Risk everybody takes. The difference between the employer and the employee is the employee takes the risk and then somebody else makes the decisions. The employer takes a risk, but he's got all the power to shape whether that risk works out. And when he has trouble, you know where he shifts the burden? He fires the workers because he doesn't want to bear the cost of the risk he took that didn't work out. If you want to reward risk, all the workers get a piece of that. You're not the specialist on risk. Stop it. In fact, your risk is less because you're rich. You take a part of your money, you know, you lose that part. It doesn't shake you. But the worker, he has no wealth to hold back, has no savings account. The risk he takes is if he gets fired, he's lost. You're not. So don't tell me about it. But if you teach in a culture all the time the absence of a Marxist perspective on the production, then you don't know these questions. You don't even know to ask them. You know, Einstein said, the hard part is the question. Once you got the question, the answer you work out. It's the question that's the hard part. The question is, why do we accept, and let me make it real personal for all of you, because Marxism is not going to go anywhere unless it's personal for all of you. Why do you, each of you sitting here, accept a system in which you go to work and you produce a surplus for some employer who decides what the hell he or she wants to do with it? And your job is to go home, not bother the employer until the next day when you come back and do that again. Why is that acceptable to you? You got rid of kings and queens and monarchy because it was unbearable to have some jerk whose achievement was to be the son of the previous jerk and was telling you what to do all the time, and you had to take your hat off when he passed in his coach. And he referred to you as his subject. We killed those people. We cut their heads off. We found it odious to have them around us. And we go to work every day where there is a king who tells you what to do, and you better take your hat off or you're fired. And then you can go and stand in line at an office downtown and hope they don't sneer at you while they give you a pittance for you to go and buy that cat food. You know, what is it? You know, why? I don't want you to ask me why I'm a Marxist. I want you to wonder why you aren't. Unless you are. The questions are very similar. The questions that came in overlapped a lot. But that's good. We're all thinking. We're thinking and we're coming up with the good questions. But this question is, like so many, is premised on the United States' backwardness. It's vast ignorance about all of this, which is not because Americans aren't smart. They're just as smart as anybody else. But this period of half a century of closing out the left and closing out Marxism really has made us, on these subjects, stupid. So let's deal with this. First of all, the Nazi phrase wasn't cultural Marxism. It was cultural Bolshevism, Kulturbolschewismus in German. My first language is German. I speak German, I read German. My mother spoke German to me all my life as a child, and so forth and so on. So it's not cultural Marxism, it's cultural Bolshevism. And here was the idea that the Soviet Revolution, which frightened the Germans very badly, because remember, Germany is not that far from Russia, literally, number one. Number two, in 1918, the year after the revolution in Russia, there was an attempt to have revolutions like the Soviet Union in Germany. Now, again, I'm assuming that, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, that you don't know about that, which is not your fault. So let me tell you briefly. In Bavaria, which is not an advanced progressive part of Germany, Bavaria is the south of Germany, and its politics are a little bit like the south of the United States. That's not true for the capital city, Munich, which is a socialist city, but it's surrounded by the Catholic part of Germany, which is the more conservative part, the way politics is shaped up there. Okay, in Bavaria, a revolution took place in 1918 and 1999, which set up, you ready? The Bavarian Soviet Socialist Republic, a name that rings a certain bell, to copy the Russians. The leader of it was a local man named Kurt Eisner. In Catholic South Germany, in Munich, the leader of the new revolution was a Jew. Complicated. It lasted a while. In Berlin, an effort was made to make a revolution too. It was led by two very famous leaders of the Socialist Party of Germany, which at that time was the second biggest party in Germany, a mass party, the same one that's still part of the coalition government with Mrs. Merkel, at least for another few days. The two leaders who tried to make this revolution, one whose name you probably don't know, Karl Liebknecht, and the other one whose name you probably do, Rosa Luxemburg. And for their effort, the military came in, killed them, hacked their bodies into pieces, and threw them in the Landwehr Canal in the middle of Berlin. They became martyrs. If you go to Berlin today, there are streets and squares and theaters named after both of them. Even now, with a unified Germany, they don't touch those historical names. If you want to see Karl Marx's name on every street sign, you go to Berlin right now. Karl Marx Allee, Karl Marx Platz, Karl Marx, you name it, Karl Marx is all over the place. And when you ask these very conservative Germans why you do that, they look at you as if you're crazy and say, that's part of our history. We are proud of Karl Marx and of Rosa Luxemburg. If you go to the center that's named after her, her sayings, her famous sayings are in the street. They have embedded in the cement of the street metallic plates with quotes from Rosa Luxemburg. That's the commitment that they have to her. Okay, so here you have what? The fear in Germany that the revolution was coming. Since they crushed these revolutions, they killed the people, and so forth, they weren't anymore afraid of a military. They weren't really afraid of the politics. They thought it would come through the culture. So the idea was Bolshevism, the Russian experience, would seep into Germany through cultural phenomena. And part of the reason this happened was that throughout the 1920s, the German culture reacted to what had happened to Germany. This is extremely important. Again, your faces give you away, the history. You need to know these things. It's part of the revolutionary tradition. In Germany, the war, World War I, was a catastrophic transformation. They lost the Kaiser, they lost their form of government, they lost their economic hope to be the defeater of Great Britain, the empire of the world, and to outstrip the United States, which was the other competitor for Britain. All of that fell apart. And as if that wasn't enough, they lost the war. And as if that wasn't enough, there was a reparations. That often hasn't happened. You know, African Americans are now talking about reparations. But the big reparations was the one imposed on Germany after World War I, when they were required to spend huge amounts of money reimbursing France and Britain for the cost of those countries defeating the Germans. So they were a destroyed economy, a destroyed society with an enormous debt they couldn't possibly pay. One of the results of that was an inflation, 1923. One of the greatest inflations in the history of the world. Let me tell you about it, because we might have one like it, and you should be prepared. Prices doubled over a period of 9 months, every 2 hours. Okay? My grandmother and grandfather, living in Germany at the time, told me the stories. Grandpa, who worked in a store, would get paid in a bag of money at lunchtime. He would run like a relay runner home and give the package to my grandma, his wife, who would run to the store to buy food with it. Because if you waited until that evening, that money would buy you 1 stick of gum, because the prices would have gone up and your money was worthless. The savings of the Germans, they're very frugal people. They had saved for 40 years, little bit put aside to save. That money was worth a quarter pound of butter overnight. They lost everything. And in that period of time, they became, like Americans are today, radicalized, extremely radicalized. They were defeated in the war, they lost the Kaiser, they were suffering reparations, and now they had lost their savings, they had nothing. A solid middle class, the Thomas Mann Buddenbrooks kind of middle class, destroyed. And they split. One part of them went to the left. You had an explosion of revolutionary culture. Probably the best expression, Bertolt Brecht. Or Hartfield, if you know the way the artistic things of that time. People, if you go to that museum up on 86th Street, what's it called? Gallery? What? The Neue Galerie. You can see there the explosion. Clay, Kandinsky, the great names of that time. These are people who developed revolutionary theater, revolutionary art, revolutionary music. But you also had the extreme go the other way, right? Adolf Hitler, who goes from nothing into, and there's the great fight between those two. And it goes the way you all know it goes. We're in exactly the same place. But it wasn't about cultural Marxism. Now, to this modern. The modern thing is different. The modern thing is the anxiety of the American right that the very failures of capitalism, look, the reality of American capitalism for 40 years, I'll put on my hat as an economist, is the following. The wages are stagnant. Wages in America, real wages, that's when you take the money a worker gets, adjusted for the prices he or she pays. Real wages in America today, right now, are roughly what they were in 1978. It's really important. Over that time, every year, workers have become more and more productive. They have more computers to work with, they have been better trained, they have all of that. So the output the worker delivers to the employer, that's what productivity means, has been going up steadily, 1-2% a year. But what the employer gives the worker, that's the real wage, is flat. That's why we have a booming stock market. Those people are collecting all the profits. All the productivity goes to the profits. The wages go nowhere. Why? Because companies have replaced workers with machinery, The computer revolution, the robots, the artificial intelligence. They've left the country to produce in China, India, Brazil, and everywhere else. And so you have a situation in which they didn't have to pay more, and they didn't. So you have grotesque inequality, Bezos and all of that. And the people with the money playing on the stock market, so it keeps going up. But the mass of people, that wonderful study of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York that says half of American families, if they're stuck with a $400 unexpected bill, can't cover it. They have to sell something. And the debts, well, that's the only way we survived. The American dream survived the last 30 years because since the wages didn't go up, Americans solved the problem another way. Everybody works a million jobs. The women, particularly the white ones, come out of the house and go to work, and they borrow up the wazoo until they reach 2008 when they can't borrow anymore and the whole cards fall apart. And we're stuck now. We're stuck. There is no way to grow now. This morning, the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases every month its information about real wages. The last month, the real wage went up 0.3% per hour. But the number of hours worked in America went down by 0.3%. In other words, nothing. Nothing. And this has happened over and over and over. The wages are going nowhere. Nowhere. They don't need it, and they're not going to do it. And Americans are at each other's throat. A bunch of them are discovering the left. And that scares the people who run this society. Part of the reason they are supporting Mr. Trump and people like him is they're getting ready to push back against the fear of where the left is going to get this. They understand the history that American radical and young people don't know. That's the sad part of this. They're getting ready because they expect something to happen because history has had that happen to them before, and they don't want to be left there out. So here's the fear. Where is this left coming from? Well, in America, it's not coming from the usual places. The labor movement in this country is dead. And if it's not dead, it is so close to death that it could be dead. And so they don't see much danger from there. Well, where is the danger? The danger is in the young people, in the universities, in the school. So they've developed this kind of fantastic notion that the universities are full of Marxists. When I was on the Fox town hall 2.5 weeks ago, Herman Cain and the others kept talking about the Marxists, the Kennedy, the libertarian lady. She was talking the university full of Marxists. I spent my entire life in America. I never found any. I kept looking too. I was looking for them. I needed friends. They are not there. I can assure you, they are not there. Are there none? Of course not. There are some. There always are some. But the notion that the universities are, no. What is true, but to be fair to them, what is true is that the university is a place that has still enough space, enough possibility that if you want to go in a radical direction, there'll probably be some other students who will do that with you, and there'll probably be some teachers you'll find who will give, yeah, that's true. That hasn't been wrung out of the system. But believe me, they're working on it. They're working on it. If you follow the Koch brothers, they are busily placing their people in many American universities. They're giving money conditional on whether a professor gets hired or not. They have some say in that. They're trying to shut that risky area down. They're particularly worried that universities are places where the diverse anti-systemic movements that exist might come together. That the people angry about racism or sexism or homophobia, or they're at the university and they're kind of together in the university and they talk to each other, and there might come some kind of scary coming together, and who knows, they might make a common cause with unions, or at least some unions that are open to it. The other day I read the woman, the air hostess, or what do they call themselves, stewardesses, or whatever. I can't keep straight. What is it?
Flight attendant.
Flight attendants. My apology if I've already offended someone. The woman is Sarah Nelson, I believe is her name. She's head of the Flight Attendants Union. She took the opportunity earlier this year, I believe it was the celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday. The AFL-CIO celebrates it each year. And she got up and called for a general strike in the United States, which for a union leader in this country at that time to do, that audience particularly, was, I mean, the silence in the room was deafening, I understand, but nonetheless, I think there's the fear, and that's what the Republicans see talking about cultural modern. Last point, postmodernism and Marxism. I find postmodernism wonderfully interesting. I make use of it. I've learned a lot from it. It is a global intellectual movement. It is about 40 years old now. It has affected every discipline I know of, certainly all the social sciences and certainly all the humanities, okay? It questions some of the most basic assumptions of Western modern thought, which is why it's postmodern. It is a powerful intellectual movement, and everybody in this room, I would argue, has much to learn from it, Marxists included, okay? I would also think that postmodernists, many of whom are very hostile to Marxism, which they see as a modernist ideology, they have a lot to learn from Marxism, and I, for one, am interested in bringing them together so we could get a conversation going and we could learn from one another. But I can assure you that to lump them together is nuts. They don't like each other in the main. The Marxists accuse postmodernists of turning young people away from Marxism into some crazy intellectual wasteland, and the postmodernists think of Marxists as silly, old, mechanical thinkers who haven't understood the problems. It's sad, but the notion of lumping them to postmodern Marxists.
Sorry,
What?
I'm sorry.
This is again ignorance. It's like cultural Marxism. You're going to get more and more of it. You're going to watch the Republicans now. They're going to start, beating up on socialism to push back on Bernie Sanders. It's so much a part of American history that of course they're going to dredge that stuff up again. Well, I think war has always been, in the history of capitalism, the final resort when you could not solve your problem another way. It's understood that way by the military. It's understood that way by the people who lead capitalism. I would urge you to understand, war doesn't begin with capitalism, obviously. It's ancient Greece and all of the rest. But capitalism has to its name an extraordinary achievement, which goes to an earlier question that Maria read. Capitalism produced the first genuine world wars. We never had that before. Partly because capitalism created a world economy, a world market. The 20th century saw World War I and World War II. Together, those wars killed, directly and indirectly, 100 million people, 200 million people, an unspeakable number of people. And these were wars among capitalist countries fighting with one another for what they thought their survival depended on. In Germany, language like Lebensraum. In German, that means literally room to live. The Germans had to have room to live. That's why they had to take Poland or take Czechoslovakia or get back the colonies that the Germans had that were taken from them in World War I. They wanted to get them back in World War II. These countries got themselves to a point where in their minds, their survival as capitalist economies depended on the destruction of some enemy. And I think capitalism has always understood that the military has to be preserved, has to be funded, has to be maintained in that way. What is new, and what's really an American invention after World War II, was the permanent massive army. Before, you kept a relatively small, and then you mobilized people. It was called that, mobilization, for the war when it became necessary. The technology was such, and the American hysteria after the war was such, that we didn't do it. And then as Eisenhower told us, you're going to develop, if you have an army this big and it lasts this long, you're going to build your society into a dependence on that. The American military long ago understood it needs to locate its bases, it needs to locate its suppliers all over the country, so all of those people will make sure that the senator and the congressman or women from that area support the budget, because that's what comes back and keeps their neighborhood employed. And so you have the industrial military complex organized to keep this going. You can see the power of that because it's become the model for others. We have a medical industrial complex. Hospitals, doctors, medical insurers, drug companies, they've gotten together just like the military and hammer it, which is why we spend not only more than any other part of the world on military. For all of you who don't know, the United States spends more on the military than the next 9 countries together, which includes Russia and China, spend. And the same thing with medical. We spend 18% of our GDP for medical care. No other country comes even close to spending that kind of money. They are able to get that because they have built themselves into the fabric of this economy, so it can't afford not to do it. That's why the end of the Cold War means nothing. They can't stop. They have to find the next Cold War. And so it's a universal, endless war on terror. That'll do. If you haven't got the Russians there, then hate the terrorists. And if that becomes funny because it doesn't seem to matter, then imagine caravans from Honduras. You know, those desperately poor people are a danger to this country. But you know, here's the solemn thing to keep in your mind. When you go back and you study Germany, it was the most culturally developed country in Europe. It's the land of Brahms, Beethoven, Bach, Goethe. My God, what society they were able to develop. And yet, under pressure of a capitalism that broke down in 1929, they were able, in their fantasy, to imagine that the whole world was after them. They became paranoid on a scale that is incredible. They killed unspeakable numbers of people in a kind of methodical elimination of other members of our own species that we've never seen before. And if you think that's peculiar to the Germans, you're wrong. That is the same mentality, and I say this using my Marxism, that can watch immigrant children be put in cages and think that somehow that's necessary, that somehow that's reasonable. That is extraordinary. That's an extraordinary cultural moment. And it tells you nothing about the children or the cages or immigration. It tells you about the mentality of a large part of this country is so upset by what they're going through. They don't have the vocabulary or the history or the help to identify what their problem is. But they are unspeakably angry and therefore immune to the kinds of appeals that normally would have reached them through their church, through their own thinking, through what, all dead. It is many times, particularly in the Midwest and the South, the church members who are foaming at the mouth about this stuff, who talk about Christian charity and family values on Sunday and then cheer those children in the cages on Monday. That's an amazing achievement. There's no psychic dissonance for these people. There's something, no bell goes off about, there's something wrong in this picture. That's a sign of deep distress. When you hear the President of the United States say, I've got the greatest economy in the world, you're living in a time warp. We have an opioid crisis that is killing 70,000 to 80,000 people a year in this country. That's way more than the wars kill us. We have a suicide rate that's off the chart. This is a disaster, what's unfolding in this country, and there's no end. The inequality gets worse. The policies to make it worse are still in place. There's no self-reflection that this can't go on. And there's no systemic awareness that there even is a system that could be otherwise. Capitalism is the end. It's what we all are. It's like Mrs. Pelosi said, remember a year or two ago when a student asked her a question, what about the socialism and capitalism? She couldn't understand what he was talking about, and she looked befuddled at him, and she said in those famous words, we're all capitalists. Exactly. Exactly. Last year, I got an invitation from the students and faculty at Boise State University in Boise, Idaho, a state that I had never visited before or since. And I was told by the people who invited me that they would pay my airfare out there or something, but they wanted me to know that the purpose was they had an all-day conference devoted to the work of Jordan Peterson, and would I be willing to debate Jordan Peterson? Now, I have to tell you, which I do with a bit of a shame face, that I had no idea who Jordan Peterson was. But I had never been to Boise, and I would like to see it. And it's a state university, and I am committed to going to state universities precisely because people like me don't go to state universities anywhere near as often as we should. So I told them yes, and I figured I'd go Google Jordan Peterson, find out who this is. And then they made it even more interesting by saying he is famous for saying that no Marxist dares to debate him. Well, so I said, you found one. So I agreed to do this. No. A few weeks later, they called me back. They were obviously very pissed off, and they said to me, he has withdrawn. He didn't do it honestly. This is what they tell me. He simply said that his fee has gone up a lot. And they're a state university. They can't pay. What he was asking was enormous, and they weren't pay it. So he's not coming. But they were so angry, they said, we would like you to come anyway and just present a talk about his work, and more importantly, Marxism and what you think young people in Idaho might get from this, which I did. And in preparation for it, I released a short video of about, I don't know, what was it, 10 minutes? Or
I think
7 minutes, in which I commented on him. I didn't comment on, he's a psychology professor, so it's not, I believe it's psychology, isn't it? Yeah, psychology professor in Canada, in Toronto. And I don't comment on that, it's not stuff that I know, but he made statements about Marxism and all of that. I know a little bit about that, so I was going to respond to that, which I did. And I wasn't insulting him, but I wasn't complimentary. I think his arguments are silly. They basically boiled down to, how could anyone in their right mind be a Marxist? Because Stalin killed a lot of people. There's always a few seconds of me being, I couldn't have heard that right. I mean, what? You know, it's just, woo. Now I'm used to it, so I'm ready for it, but it always takes me kind of aback. It's like saying, I can't be a Christian because of the Inquisition. What? You know, yes, the Inquisition, terrible. And yes, they did that. And Christians have done all kinds of horrible things, but you kind of separate the thing into its various parts. That's not an excuse, it's just an understanding that people can do all kinds of things in the name of God knows what, right? The United States is busy bringing democracy to Afghanistan. I understand what that means. It has nothing to do with those words, but I understand. This society needs to say crap like that, and okay. But it's an argument that you couldn't possibly be a Marxist because Stalin did something awful. And so I made fun of this and using arguments like that. It bothered him. He gave answers. He made videos. He changed the story a little bit. So we've had a bit of a back and forth. But his argument really is that you can't possibly be interested in Marxism because people using the name Marxist have done awful things. Stalin referred to himself as a Marxist. He did awful things. He really enjoyed saying Hitler's movement, the Nazi, those are the first four letters of the German word National, which means national. And then the full name of the Nazi party was the Nationalsozialistische Arbeiterpartei, the National Socialist Workers' Party. Why? Because in Germany at that time, if you didn't have the word socialist, the working class wouldn't pay attention to you. He had to do that in order. But his commitment to socialism was mostly to kill those people. Which, if you know anything about the history, you know people who died in concentration camps in Germany were not just Jews. They were Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, socialists, and communists who were the great enemy of the Nazi. To say that he would, see, he's a socialist too. I mean, come on. This is childish. For a professor of psychology to use an argument like that kind of boggles the mind. And then he got a little sloppy. Lenin, presided over the deaths. Just again, the history. Lenin was the guy who made the revolution, but he died shortly thereafter. The revolution is in 1917. Lenin gets a brain aneurysm in 1922, and he's dead in 1923. Stalin isn't even in charge of anything at that time. To blame what Stalin did on Lenin is an interesting move, but requires the kind of argumentation that Mr. Peterson doesn't think is necessary. They're very strange kinds of, and it is something, a junior high school dropout might be allowed to reason like that. But this guy has no excuse for it. This is pure 1950s anti-communism recycled, rehashed. It's kind of beneath contempt, It's like someone who says the United States is evil because it's the only country on earth that dropped an atomic bomb on somebody. I mean, that's true. The United States, the only country that dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And that is a distinctive quality, and that has to be analyzed, just like what happened in Russia under Stalin. It has to be analyzed, and you try to understand it, and why did that happen? And it's not an excuse of it, but to try to make sense of it. You can't escape it. It's there. It's part of the history of the Soviet Union, and has to be dealt with, good, bad, or indifferent. But the notion that it is therefore the reason to throw the entire Marxist canon out of the window, that's not serious. That is a hatchet job which should not pass the lips of a person who claims to be driven by the highest sort of values. But that's not, Jordan Peterson, for those of you that are not, that's not what he's about. Jordan Peterson is a guru for, I'm going to try to be polite, young men who are having real troubles relating to young women, who really want to, but don't really know how to, and are very frustrated and very lonely and feel bad about all of this. And he tells them it's not their fault.
Marxism's fault.
No. No, although, he may get to that. Mostly it's the fault of the women, the fault of the young women who are, whatever. It's not my field, and I don't want to comment on it, but it sure sounds like he's a walking self-help book of the sort you shouldn't buy.
But I thought that was great, actually. I was going to upload that to the other channel. Clearly couldn't. So I was like, fuck it, I'll just use fuck another one. So, yeah. I'll be back in about 2 hours. Something like that. Yeah, about 2 hours. For Politics Live, which will be on at 12:15, I think it is today. Yep. So yeah, I'll be back. Thank you if you found your way over there, I suppose. But I really like that video, so I wanted to upload it. Because, you know, in my side chats, I get a lot of people who shout socialism and Marxism and shit, which is quite funny. But I don't have a fucking clue. So for that, make this one of my proprietary uploads. But it's nice that it's the first video I've uploaded, I guess. So it's all good. Yes, I'll be back later. 2 hours. So go make a cup of tea or coffee. Have your breakfast. And I will see you lovely people in 2 hours. Peace.